Hello students, this is Dr. Martina Hesser. This is part 2 of our lecture on Italy and Spain in the 17th century today. And now we will talk about an artist who comes also from Bologna, and his name is Guido Reni. Guido Reni was born in Bologna and apprentice of Denis Calgert. When Reni was about 20 years old, the three Calgert pupils migrated to the rising rival studio named Accademia degli Incamminati, which means the Academy of the Newly Embarked, led by Lodovico Carracci. They went on to form the nucleus of a prolific and successful school of Bolognese painters who all followed Annibale Carracci to Rome. This is Guido Reni's Aurora from about 1613 to 1614. Reni paints a wonderful fresco of Aurora in the summer house of the Palazzo Rospigliosi in Rome. The massive fresco is framed in quadri riportati and depicts Apollo in his chariot, preceded by Dawn, who's also called Aurora, bringing light to the world. Following his car are the hours, the paler moments who rule over the declining day. They are of no mortal grace and beauty, but still they are eclipsed by Aurora herself. She sails on the golden clouds before them, shedding showers of shadowing roses on the rejoicing earth. Her celestial presence diffuses light and brings beauty to the world. Above the heads of the heavenly coursers, however, the morning star, in a form of a youthful cherub bearing his flames, is right there. The work is restrained in classicism. Reni copies poses from Roman sarcophagi, and in this shows far more simplicity and restraint than other contemporaries. This is Guido Reni's Massacre of the Innocents from slightly before the Aurora. The painting is based on the biblical episode of the Massacre of the Innocents, described only in the Gospel of Matthew. The composition shows a series of episodes at the same time and creates a sense of confusion and agitation. Two killer soldiers, one portrayed from behind while rushing onto a screaming woman. The mothers are reacting in different ways. One is screaming and attempting to escape the soldier who has grabbed her hair. Another is fleeing towards the right while embracing her child. And another one in the lower left corner is holding her child on her shoulders. One mother rises to stop a soldier with her left hand, and a kneeling woman is praying towards the sky above the children which have already been slaughtered. Reni creates a compressed scene of great dynamism here. The movements of the figures run in large diagonals through the work and overwhelm the viewer. We are caught in the drama and horror of the moment. Now I want to look at a third painting done by Guido Reni much later in his career at around 1630, and that is his Madonna with the Patron Saints of Bologna. The painting was commissioned by the government of Bologna to thank the Virgin of the Rosary after the end of the plague in 1630. Originally, it was used as a standard and carried in a yearly procession commemorating the end of the epidemic. The procession moved from the Palazzo Comunale to the Church of St. Dominic, and once there, the standard was exhibited in the church for 3 days. The great painting follows a thorough hierarchical order. In the middle are the patron saints of Bologna, Petronius, Dominic, Proclus, and Florian, and two Jesuit saints. The two Jesuit saints are Ignatius of Loyola and Francis Xavier. And they are all gathered around St. Francis. All the saints look thankfully into the direction of the Virgin. The grayish shade of the sky is interrupted by the rainbow introducing the Madonna, calm and regal, lighted by only warm beams of lights in the whole painting. In the lower part, the town of Bologna looks desolately gray, depopulated by the plague, with no shades and halftones. The only signs of life are the small figures of the Monati, collecting the dead bodies. The patron saints and the two Jesuit saints are a significant iconographical change. Usually, the plague was associated with Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian. He was the first one because he had plague himself, and the second one because the arrows of his body were compared to the plague wounds. The altarpiece has a strong votive meaning. It shows how people of Bologna had committed themselves to the Virgin and the patron saints, and how grateful they were to be alive. The painting was done on silk and is now stretched on stretchers, so it's actually framed nowadays. It's no longer a standard. Now let's talk about Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, or sometimes people are just calling him Caravaggio. Caravaggio was born in a village of the same name. He trained as a painter in Milan under a master who had himself trained under Titian. In mid-1592, Caravaggio arrived in Rome, and I'm going to give you a quote here. He arrived, quote, naked and extremely needy, without fixed address, and without provision, short of money, end of quote. A few months later, he was performing work for the highly successful Giuseppe Cesari, Pope Clement VIII's favorite painter, painting flowers and fruit in his factory-like workshop. He left Cesari in 1594, befriends painter Prospero Orsi and architect Onorio Longhi, as well as a 16-year-old Sicilian painter, Mario Miniti. Miniti serves as a model and later helps him get commissions in Sicily. Miniti and Caravaggio might have been a couple for some time. And around the same time, he attracted the patronage of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte. For him, he creates a couple of intimate chamber pieces, musicians, card players, such as this one here maybe, or maybe a Bacchus or a boy bitten by a lizard. Here is an image showing musicians from about the same period. I should point out that probably his apprentice Minetti is the one shown right here on the second from the right. Or something like this, a boy bitten by a lizard. The possibly homoerotic ambience of some of these paintings has been the center of considerable dispute amongst scholars and biographers since it was first raised in the later half of the 20th century. I should mention that sexuality was handled quite differently during the Renaissance and the Baroque periods, and even later. It was quite possible that married men would engage in homosexual relationships with other people, mostly younger men or even boys. This was a somewhat socially accepted practice that went back to ancient Greece. This might explain a number of works Caravaggio produces that show very young boys, such as this one here, engaged in various activities and also sometimes dressed up with flowers in their hair, like this one here, or the slipping garment that reveals a very erotic shoulder here. One of those works is this one here, an image called Amor Vincit Omnia from 1602. The title is Latin and it means love conquers all. The little Cupid is wearing dark eagle wings and is shown half sitting on or perhaps climbing down from what appears to be a table. Scattered around are the emblems of all human endeavors: violin and lute, armor, cornet, square and compass, pen and manuscript, bay leaves, and an astral globe, tangled and trampled under Cupid's foot. The painting illustrates a line from Virgil's Ecloges: Amor vincit omnia et nos sedamus amori, which means love conquers all, let us all yield to love. The subject was a common one for the age. The surprising realism, however, was not. Caravaggio's treatment is remarkable for the realism of his Cupid. Where other depictions show an idealized, almost generic, beautiful boy, Caravaggio's Cupid is highly individual, charming but not at all beautiful. He has crooked teeth and a crooked grin. One feels that one would recognize him in the street. The shock of the Caravaggio, quite apart from the dramatic chiaroscuro lighting and the photographic clarity, is the mingling of the allegorical and the real. This rendering gives the sense of a child who is having a thoroughly good time dressing up in stage prop wings with a bunch of arrows and having his picture painted. Inevitably, much scholarly and non-scholarly ink has been spilled over the eroticism of the painting. Yet the homoerotic content was perhaps not so apparent to the owner of the piece, Vincenzo Giustiniani, and his generation as it has become today. Naked boys could be seen on any riverbank or seashore. The fact that children were eroticized is very much a cultural artifact of the present day rather than Caravaggio's day and age. Certainly neither Giustiniani, who was not a homosexual, nor his visitors appear to have been concerned by the question of modesty, or to have even raised it. The story that the Marchese kept his armor hidden and behind a curtain relates to his reported wish that it should be kept as a final pièce de résistance for visitors, to be seen only when the rest of the collection had been viewed. In other words, the curtain was to reveal the painting, not to hide it. The challenge is to see the armor through 17th century eyes and not retroactively through the mind of a 21st century viewer. However, I believe it is fair to say that sexuality seems to be a central concern of the painter. The middle of the painting is reserved for the uncovered genitalia of the boy. Caravaggio's extreme lighting effects also seem to zero in on it. I think it's fair to say that this probably is not a coincidence. Open depiction of sexuality in children makes many viewers today uncomfortable. Were we to follow this train of thought, we would inevitably end up with questions of child prostitution, social and economic dependencies, rampant poverty, and the like. Now, let's explain chiaroscuro. This is an Italian term which means light and dark. This painting exhibits an extreme version of light and darkness. It is called tenebroso, or tenebrism in English. And Caravaggio is the first artist to use it. Tenebroso means murky in Italian. And indeed, this is what we see. The artist starts out with an almost black background and works his way toward some extremely illuminated areas. He combines this with an almost photographic-looking hyperrealism that makes us pause. Now a couple of words to Caravaggio's more than flamboyant personality. We know that he was jailed on several occasions, vandalized his own apartment, and ultimately had a death warrant issued against him by the Pope. An early published notice on him dating from 1604 and describing his lifestyle 3 years previously tells us how, quote, "After a fortnight work, he will swagger about for a month or two, with a sword at his side and a servant following him from one ball court to the next, ever ready to engage in a fight or an argument, so that it is most awkward to get along with him," end of quote. In 1606, he killed a young man in a brawl and fled from Rome with a price on his head. He fled to Naples, where he lived and worked for about 9 months, leaving behind him a larger-than-life legacy. After that, he moved to Malta to work for the Maltese Knights. He had to leave this employment after he had beaten up one of the friars. He went to Sicily to reconnect with his former apprentice, Mario Minetti, and there he was hoping for a papal pardon. By this time, Caravaggio was highly paranoid, slept in his clothes and with a dagger in his hand. He died in 1610 while he was on his way to Rome, probably of a fever. He was 37 years old. In 1599, presumably through the influence of Del Monte, Caravaggio contracted to decorate the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi dei Francesi. The two works making up the commission was the Martyrdom of St. Matthew, and the Calling of St. Matthew. And he delivered those two in 1600. They were an immediate sensation. Caravaggio's tenebrism, a heightened chiaroscuro, brought high drama to his subjects, while his acutely observed realism brought a new level of emotional intensity. Opinion among Caravaggio's artist peers was polarized. Some denounced him for various perceived failings, notably his insistence on painting from life without drawings. But for the most part, he was hailed as a savior of art, and here's a quote. "The painters then in Rome were greatly taken by this novelty, and the young ones particularly gathered around him, praised him as the unique imitator of nature, and looked on his work as miracles. His realism was seen as vulgar," end of quote. When Caravaggio painted the Groom's Madonna, it was taken down from its display in St. Peter after 2 days, and this is the piece. A cardinal secretary wrote about it, and here's the quote. "In this painting there are but vulgarity, sacrilege, impiousness, and disgust. One would say it is a work made by a painter that can paint well, but of a dark spirit, and who has been for a long time far from God, from his adoration, and from any good thought," end of quote. And the reason for this was that the Madonna here was depicted as an ordinary woman. She has dirty feet, and also the baby boy that she's holding here does not look divine at all. He looks like a Roman street boy. So that naturalism, or naturalism in conjunction with holy figures, was something that was very hard to accept for some of the clients and some of the audiences in Rome at the time, because they had this idealized expectation or perception of their favorite saints or martyrs. So another piece that I wanted to talk about today is Caravaggio's conversion of St. Paul from 1600 or 1601. And this really shows us here again a religious subject matter and a scene from after the life of Jesus Christ. So here we see St. Paul, who at that point in time was a Roman soldier and was called Saul. And his job was to round up the Christians in the Holy Land and bring them to Rome to be brought into the Colosseum. and executed there. So we see our Roman soldier here, and while he was on one of his campaigns, he encountered God in the form of light. And there is really no better painter to focus on the miraculous effects of light than Caravaggio, because he really works with light primarily. So what we see here is St. Paul, kind of already fallen off the horse, the back of his horse, and on his back. And he has his arms thrown up in the air in astonishment. His eyes are closed because he is blinded by the divine light. And now he repents and he changes his ways and becomes a follower of Jesus Christ. And he is one of the first writers who writes about Jesus' life. And we know these letters now. They are now in the collection of the Bible. So what we see here is something that doesn't look like a heroic divine intervention at all. It looks more like a stable accident. The viewer is very close to the subject matter, to the figures themselves. And the figures seem to emerge from the dark, especially the figure in the back. The horse also is not idealized. And here we see a wonderful juxtaposition of what it means to paint something in a realistic way as opposed to an idealistic way. Because if you look at that horse, it looks tired. It looks like it wants to go home and just sleep a little bit and rest. Whereas if we think about it, an idealized horse, let's say a horse of a knight, white stallion who comes to save you from a boring art history lecture, that's not the horse we have in mind that we see here, right? So here's a stark contrast to our expectations and how we idealize things in our minds, as opposed to the realism that he shows us here. This piece was ultimately rejected, right? And also one of the points of criticism was that the keeper of the horse in the back was this old toothless man with the dirty feet, and that really did not sit well with patrons and audiences who wanted to have a more idealized view of the world and of this sacred story. Now let's talk about one of Caravaggio's followers, and this is actually a female artist, and her name is Artemisia Gentileschi. She was born in Rome, and she was the daughter of Orazio Gentileschi, who was a painter. She got educated alongside her brothers, but showed much more promise. When she was 17, she paints a large painting called Susanna and the Elders, which is now in the Schönborn collection. And she was denied membership at the academies because she was a woman. Her father introduces her to Agostino Tassi, a friend and colleague of her father, and she starts to paint with him. Very soon thereafter, there are allegations of rape, and their relationship gets reported to the authorities, probably by her father himself. There seems to be a broken promise of marriage. What followed was a 7-month trial by the Inquisition. Under torture, it was discovered that Tassi had planned to murder his wife. He had enjoyed an adultery with his sister-in-law and had planned to steal some of Orazio Gentileschi's painting. But we all know what to think about these confessions that were done under enhanced interrogation techniques. So this is probably to be taken with a grain of salt. During the trial, Artemisia was given a gynecological examination by the Inquisition, which sounds very awful to me. And she was tortured using a device made of thongs wrapped around her fingers and tightened by degrees. This is a particularly cruel torture technique to a painter. It will potentially break bones and ligaments in the hands and render a painter unfit for his or her profession. Both procedures were used to corroborate the truth of her allegations. Torture was used because people believed that if a person could tell the same story under torture as without, the story must be true. At the end of the trial, Tassi was imprisoned for 1 year. To save what was left of his daughter's honor, Orazio Gentileschi arranged her marriage to Pierantonio Stiattesi, a Florentine artist. What was unusual about this was that Artemisia remained active as a painter, probably because she was much better than her husband. Because of the trial, she had gained some notoriety, which might have brought her some clients, so this might have also been a good reason for her to keep on painting. The couple moved to Florence, where Artemisia enjoys the patronage of the Medici. At a later point, she travels to England and works for her father, who at that point in time works for King Charles I in England. So that's an unusual life story if you think about that. After her husband's death, Artemisia moves to Naples, and Naples has a great love for these very dark paintings in the Tenebroso style. The reason for that was that Caravaggio himself stayed there for 9 months at some point in his life, and he really left a very profound legacy in Naples. So she knew there would be a market for that type of art, and she really all her life stuck with the Tenebroso style that she learns in Rome that ultimately goes back to Caravaggio. So if we look at an early painting here, where we see a story of the Old Testament, and that is Judith decapitating Holofernes from around 1615 to 1620, just about. We see a very unusual subject matter for a female artist. First of all, it's a large painting, and that's unusual because usually women artists only painted small pieces because of the cost of the material. But also it is the subject matter itself. It's a large history painting. That's unusual for a woman. And then it shows us here a very bloody scene from the Old Testament. And here in particular, a scene where a woman is the perpetrator, where a woman looks very calm and collected, and is the one who holds the sword and cuts the head off this Assyrian general. The story of Judith is this one. Judith was the daughter of a king, and the city was under siege by an Assyrian army. And the leader of this army was Holofernes, so he was a general. And after her father and all her male family members had died, Judith decided that it was up to her to save the city. And she invited Holofernes over for dinner. Now you're going to say this was more than a dinner, right? Because he's sleeping in probably her bed. So maybe there were some exchanges of sexual favors here. Let's leave it at that. But maybe also the guy was a little bit inebriated and had to rest for a while. And this is her chance. This is when Judith springs into action, when she comes in with her maidservant, and she tells the servant to hold him down, and she takes the sword out of the general and she hacks off his head, and you see the blood gushing out of his wound on the neck. And she's very calm and collected. If you look at her hand, she almost looks like she's getting ready to cut open a turkey. So there is no notion that her hands look delicate or extremely female, or according to the beauty ideals of the day and age. And those beauty ideals for females were primarily these demure kind of characteristics. None of this is visible here. So we have a woman artist who probably looked at her own hands in the course of her work and portrayed that, rather than a male beauty ideal that we would see in depictions or portraits of women that were done by men. And this kind of would lead us, if we were to follow that train of thought, this would lead us to what's called gender studies, which is a very interesting area of study that is starting to be interesting probably for graduate students more than for an undergraduate class. But just to give you a little bit of her impression of herself, here's a self-portrait that she makes later on in her life, where she shows herself as a personification of painting. La pittura means painting. And she really works with everything she's got in this case, because this is a relatively small painting. And it shows this very young and attractive woman in the act of painting. And you see an outlook into her low-cut dress and into her bosom. And she's wearing a gold chain. And as a pendant, she wears a golden skull that's hanging off of her neck here. So this would be a painting that she would show to a client. And as you can imagine, the first thing they would notice, because they're all male clients, is that this is a young and beautiful female, and probably secondarily an artist here who is advertising for her talents here. So she knew how to stand up for herself as a woman, and she kind of made her own life story that at some point was quite tragic, as we mentioned before, and made it work for her own purposes. She lived to be a very old lady, and we know that she was able to provide a dowry for her daughters. There were 2 daughters that survived after her husband and some other children died, and she did pretty well for herself, and she later on died in Naples. Thank you.